Number 1. Sacsayhuamán. Start with a wall. Massive stone blocks, some taller than a person, fitted together so tightly that the classic test, and people really do this, is to try to slide a sheet of paper into the joints. You cannot. No mortar, no gaps. The edges are curved and locked into their neighbors like puzzle pieces cut by someone with an unhealthy obsession with precision. Now the numbers. Some of these blocks weigh well over 100 tons. And here is the part that should stop you. This masonry has shrugged off 5 centuries of earthquakes, the same earthquakes that flattened the neat, mortared colonial buildings the Spanish put up next door. The Inca stonework just sits there, unbothered. And this is the first lesson of this entire video, so let me say it plainly up front. When I say a site broke the timeline, I do not only mean it was shockingly old. Sacsayhuamán is only about 500 or 600 years old. Inca, 15th century. What it broke was our sense of what people of that era could physically do, because we still cannot fully agree on how they shaped stone this hard, this precisely, and moved blocks this heavy with the tools we know they had. That gap between what we can see and what we can explain is exactly the gap a certain kind of theory loves to crawl into. We will meet it properly later. Hold that thought. From stones fitted perfectly into a mountainside to stones stacked impossibly on the open ocean. Number 2. Madol. Picture sailing for days. Open Pacific in every direction. Nothing but water and horizon. And then you arrive at a city built on the sea. Not by the sea, on it. Across a shallow reef off a remote island in Micronesia, someone stacked enormous logs of black basalt into walls and platforms, building roughly 100 artificial islets laced together by canals. People have called it the Venice of the Pacific, which rather undersells it, because Venice did not have to float its own foundations in on rafts. Those basalt columns weigh several tons each. They were moved into place, as far as anyone can tell, without draft animals, without the wheel, across open water. The main building phase runs to somewhere around the 12th and 13th centuries. Number 3. The temples of Malta and the Hypogeum beneath them. Quick question. Where are the oldest freestanding stone temples on Earth? Most people would guess Egypt, or Mesopotamia. The answer is a pair of tiny islands in the middle of the Mediterranean that barely anyone could find on a map. Malta's megalithic temples were built around 3600 BCE. Sit with that. That is roughly 1,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. The people who raised them were a small island population working with stone tools, and they were building monumental sacred architecture before the great river civilizations we usually crown as first had even gotten around to it. And then there is the strange one, the Çatalhöyük Hypogeum, an entire complex carved down into the rock across 3 levels, a subterranean world of chambers and passages, cut by hand. One of those chambers has become famous for an acoustic quirk. Stand in the right spot, speak in a low voice, and the room seems to seize the sound, a deep resonance you feel in your chest. People have built all sorts of mystical theories on top of that. The careful version is simpler, and almost as interesting. The chamber's shape happens to amplify certain low frequencies. Whether the builders designed that on purpose, we honestly do not know. What Malta reset was the where and the when. The megalith story does not politely begin with the famous empires. It begins out here, on a rock in the sea. From the oldest temple in the Mediterranean to a tomb in a green Irish field that is also older than the pyramids, and that catches the sun exactly once a year. And what Madol broke was a lazy assumption a lot of people quietly carried, that small, isolated Pacific island societies simply could not produce monumental engineering on this scale. They could. They did. We are still arguing about exactly how they floated and lifted that much basalt. The leading ideas involve rafts and ramps and an enormous amount of human muscle. But the how being unsolved does not change the they did it. Madol pushed a continent's worth of assumptions out into the ocean. The next site pushed the calendar itself backward, and it is hiding under the ground. Number 4. Newgrange. In the green countryside of Ireland, there is what looks like a grassy hill, a gentle mound, sheep wandering around it, except it is not a hill. It is a tomb, and it was built around 3,200 BCE, older than Giza, older than the great standing stones of Stonehenge. It has been sitting in that field, quietly, for over 5,000 years. Now, plenty of ancient cultures buried their dead in mounds. What makes Newgrange break the timeline is the engineering. It is a passage tomb, a long stone corridor leading deep into the heart of the mound, to a central chamber. And for most of the year, that chamber sits in total darkness. But on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, as the sun rises, a beam of light slips through a precisely placed opening above the entrance, travels all the way down that stone passage, and floods the inner chamber with gold for a few short minutes, once a year, on purpose. That is calendrical astronomy, built into architecture by Neolithic farmers thousands of years before we would casually assume anyone was doing precision solar timekeeping in stone. They did not have writing. They had a building that knows the date. From a single tomb that catches the solstice to the most famous stones on the planet, the ones we have stared at for centuries and still cannot fully explain. Number 5. Stonehenge. Everyone knows Stonehenge, which is exactly why it belongs on this list, because for something so famous, almost nothing about it is actually settled, and the science keeps quietly rewriting the plaque. Here is the rough shape of what we do know. The huge sarsen stones, the iconic ones, were raised around 2500 BCE. But the smaller stones, the blue stones, came from somewhere astonishing. Geologists traced them to the Preseli Hills in Wales, over 150 miles away. People hauled multi-ton stones 150 miles across rivers and hills with Neolithic technology, because apparently nothing closer would do. And then it gets stranger. One major hypothesis, and I will flag this clearly, it is a live debate, not a settled fact, and it has been softened since it was first proposed, argues that those blue stones did not start at Stonehenge at all. They may have first stood as a stone circle in Wales near the quarries, and were then dismantled and dragged across the country to be rebuilt on Salisbury Plain. A monument that moved house, which reframes the whole question. For years, we asked how on earth they moved stones that far. The deeper question is why? Why did it matter so much that these particular stones from this particular place had to be the ones, even if it meant carrying a mountain across a country? Britain dragged its stones across a country. The next people cut theirs so precisely that to this day, some people flatly refuse to believe humans did it at all. Quick aside, because we are about to walk straight into the most argued about site on this entire list. If you're the kind of person who finds it weirdly satisfying watching the record get corrected instead of mystified, the slow, unglamorous, genuinely beautiful work of handing the credit back to real people, and subscribing actually helps. It just tells the algorithm to put more of this in front of more people who think the way you do. No hard sell. Now, let us talk about the aliens. Number 6. Puma Punku. If you have ever watched late night cable and seen a man with very memorable hair explain that ancient people could not possibly have built something, so it must have been visitors from space, there is a very good chance the something was Puma Punku. This site, high on the Bolivian Altiplano, is the patron saint of the ancient aliens genre. So let us do the thing this channel actually exists to do. Let us look at the evidence. What is really there is genuinely striking. Puma Punku is part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, and it is littered with the famous H-blocks, stones cut with crisp right angles, smooth faces, and interchangeable, almost modular shapes, as if they were stamped from a single template. They are precise enough that the first time you see them, your brain does reach for the word machined. And here come 3 ways to read that, escalating from the wild to the careful. The fringe reading, which gets the airtime in the documentaries, is that this is impossibly ancient, tens of thousands of years old, cut by lost technology we have somehow forgotten. It is the most exciting version. It also has, to put it gently, the least evidence behind it, so we treat it as the minority view it is. The middle reading is about technique. Skilled stoneworkers, using harder stones as abraders, working with templates and standardized molds, even pouring some components from a kind of cast, can absolutely produce repeatable, modular shapes. Precision does not require lasers. It requires patience, a system, and a lot of people. And the mainstream reading, which gets the last and heaviest word, is this. Tiwanaku was a sophisticated Andean civilization, and the site dates to roughly the 6th century of the Common Era, not 15,000 years ago. Real people, real skill, real, ordinary, astonishing human ability. And here is the honest part the documentaries skip. Debunking the alien claim does not make Puma Punku less impressive. It makes it more, because the achievement stops belonging to imaginary visitors and goes back to the people who actually earned it with their own 2 hands. Puma Punku stuns you with stone. The next site has almost no monuments at all, and it still managed to rewrite the definition of a city. Number 7. Çatalhöyük. Try to picture a city with no streets, no roads, no alleys, no front doors, and no plan laid out by anyone in charge. In central Turkey, around 9,000 years ago, thousands of people lived in exactly that, a settlement called Çatalhöyük, packed so tightly that the mud brick houses shared walls, with no gaps between them at all. So, how did you get home? You went across the roofs. The rooftops were the streets. You walked over the top of the whole town and dropped into your own house through a hole in the ceiling, down a ladder. Your neighbors, in every direction, were close enough to hear everything. It was, you might say, the original open plan living, with a homeowners association made up of literally everyone you have ever met. And it gets more intimate than that. They buried their dead underneath the floors of their own homes. They slept, quite literally, on top of their ancestors. What Çatalhöyük broke was the tidy definition of an early city. Here was dense, complex, communal urban life. Thousands of people solving the daily problem of living on top of each other, thousands of years before the famous city-states we usually credit as the first cities. It forces a simple, awkward question. If this is not a city, what is it? And if it is one, then our timeline for cities is wrong. Çatalhöyük rewrote what a city is. The next site built a tower before cities existed at all. Number 8, the Tower of Jericho. Jericho is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on the planet, and buried in its earliest layers is a structure often called the oldest tower in the world. A solid cone of stone built into the ancient settlement of Tel es-Sultan around 8000 BCE. And when the archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated it in the mid-20th century, the date she was dealing with was staggering. This thing went up before pottery, before metal, before cities, before writing, before basically every box on the civilization starter kit. Building it meant quarrying, hauling, and stacking stone, which meant organizing a lot of people, feeding them, and coordinating the work, in an era we had assumed was far too early for that kind of large-scale cooperation. The tower is, in effect, a receipt, proof that complex social organization existed thousands of years earlier than the script allowed. And the best part is, we still argue about what it was for. A defensive watchtower? A barrier against the floods and mud flows rolling off the hills? A ritual structure? A stage for ceremony? A monument to somebody important? Each theory has its supporters, and none of them has won. A 9,000-year-old building, and we do not actually know why they built it. That is the hook. Jericho moved the date for a single building. The next discovery moved the date for an entire continent. Number 9. Monte Verde and the footprints at White Sands. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology had one rule, and it was treated as basically a law of nature. The first people to reach the Americas were a group called the Clovis culture, who arrived around 13,000 years ago. Clovis first. And if you were a young archaeologist who found something that looked older, the smart career move was to assume you had made a mistake, because suggesting otherwise was a fast way to get laughed out of the room. Then came Monte Verde in southern Chile, a site excavated by the archaeologist Tom Dillahay, with solid evidence of people living there around 14,500 years ago, comfortably before Clovis. The old guard fought it hard for years, but the evidence held, and Clovis first, the rule that had defined the entire field, simply broke, and then it broke further. At White Sands, in New Mexico, researchers found fossilized human footprints pressed into ancient mud and dated them to somewhere around 21 to 23,000 years ago. I will flag that one honestly. The dating has been challenged and re-examined and challenged again, and it is still being argued over. but the case has been getting stronger, not weaker. So read it as a ladder. The cautious step? People were here before Clovis. The bolder step? They may have been here many thousands of years earlier than that. And the open frontier? We honestly do not yet know how far back the true first really goes. This is the cleanest break in the whole video. Not a building we reinterpreted, a paradigm that collapsed under the sheer weight of better evidence. That changed when humans arrived. The last site changed what they could build, long before anyone said they could. Number 10. Göbekli Tepe. Southeastern Turkey. A low, dusty hill, the kind you would walk straight past. An earlier survey had glanced at it decades before, seen some broken limestone poking out of the dirt, and written the whole place off as a medieval graveyard. Not worth the trouble. Then, in the 1990s, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt went back, looked properly, and realized the field had made an enormous mistake. Those were not medieval graves. This was Göbekli Tepe, and it is, as far as we currently know, the oldest monumental site of its kind on Earth. Rising out of the ground are great T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them many tons each, carved with foxes and snakes and scorpions and vultures and boars, and arranged deliberately into rings. And the date is the thing that knocks you flat, roughly 11,500 years old. This was built before agriculture, before pottery, before the wheel, before writing, by people we had filed away as simple roaming hunter-gatherers. And it does not just move a date, it threatens the whole order of the story. The textbook sequence was always this. First, humans invent farming. Then, farming creates settled villages. Then, settlements create surplus. And only then, comfortable, well-fed, with time on their hands, do people build temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests the arrow might point the other way, that the desire to gather and build something monumental together may have come first, and may have helped pull people towards settling down and farming in order to sustain it. To be fair, the latest research complicates the neat version of that story, but even the careful version is a quiet earthquake. So, 3 readings, one last time. The fringe one, a lost advanced civilization, gets the airtime and the least evidence, so it stays the minority view. The middle one, a great gathering and ritual place that kickstarted social complexity. And the mainstream one, carrying the heaviest weight, extraordinarily capable hunter-gatherers, fully human, far earlier and far more sophisticated than the old model ever allowed, with the question of why still genuinely, thrillingly open. And then there is the last detail, the one that keeps you up at night. At some point, the people who built Göbekli Tepe took this impossible, sacred, world-first place and deliberately buried it. On purpose, filled it back in with earth. And we do not know why. And maybe that is the real lesson hiding in all 10 of these places. Not one of them needed aliens. Only ordinary people who turned out to be smarter, earlier, and far more capable than we kept insisting they were. The timeline of human history was never carved in stone. It was always written in pencil.